My name is Aveen Karim. I'm the Deputy Foreign Editor here at The National. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So today marks a very important day in the region. A year ago, we were caught by surprise when the Assad regime fell after a relatively peaceful offensive, despite about 14 years of civil war in the country. Since then, the new government, which is led by Ahmed al-Shara, has been making the headlines quite a lot in the past year, especially as he has been trying to recalibrate both his image and Syria's image, both domestically and abroad. We were among that foreign media that immediately went to Syria when the Assad regime fell. And I am joined here today by our foreign editor, Ali Harisi, our Lebanon correspondent, Nada, Turkey correspondent, Lizzie, and Jordan correspondent, Khalid. So thank you all for joining. So Nada, I'm going to start with you first because you were among those reporters that immediately went to Damascus when they took the city, and you're also part Syrian. So I wanted to get like your personal experience with this. As someone who hadn't been there for quite a lot of years, what was your first impression and feeling when you finally made it back and in the circumstances that you did?
I mean, I think first of all, when I got there, I was still in disbelief. I woke up and uh, and that was it. Alas, the regime had fallen and rebels had taken over. So after the initial shock and actually getting there, and starting to report, I think the craziest thing to me is going to sound so small and so subtle, but it's that Syrians were using their real names to speak to me for the first time ever. I covered Syria before I worked for the National for a few years, and I don't think I recall a single time where I interviewed someone inside Syria that agreed to use their real name. They usually chose anonymity for fear of retribution or for security reasons. And for this time, everyone was just using their real name. I mean, very freely to the point where I was like, are you sure you want to use your real name for this? I mean, it's still a very unstable time. We don't know what's going to happen. And they would be, yes, I want to use my real name. We're talking about at that point, it was when the dictatorship had escaped to Russia, and a lot of the security branches and prisons had been flung open, and we were discovering kind of a lot of the difficulties and kind of the depravity of the prison system that was there. And so people were really eager and keen to start talking about that. But that was a very specific period. It was the honeymoon period in Syria. Now I've noticed that it's gotten back to people being more wary of using their real name for sure, for a variety of different reasons, whether they want to not be perceived as being critical of the government and they want to speak freely so they don't want to use their real name, or for example, with some minorities who are scared and don't want their real name associated when they're speaking about sensitive topics. Yeah, that would I say is the biggest thing that really stuck out to me as a Syrian, especially someone that had been covering Syria for a while, before I worked at the National and became the Lebanon correspondent. Um, yeah, but I mean, how to describe how it was when I was there for the first time back? It was also the first time that journalists were freely allowed to enter Syria, and before I was covering it from
Yeah.
outside. I can say without exaggeration that I smelled like death and corpses for the first 2 weeks because we were going into the prisons, the security centers, the security branches, as well as visiting different mass graves. And I can't describe that smell. Would like it sticks to you, it gets into your nose, you can't get rid of it. And it was every day going out and covering these kinds of things and seeing the extent of what life was like under the regime. So I think the smell is the thing that sticks out to me the most from those first days there.
Yeah, we'll get into this experience that you had when you visited the prison as well as the mass graves later on. But To your point of as someone who has covered Syria before, Khalid, also, you were based in Syria for many years before, and you had to leave in 2011 when the revolution started. You finally went back this year, and I also want to get your sense of how did it strike you when you went back? Because there must have been, a massive difference and a huge amount of destruction since 2011.
Well, no matter how much information is available on these regimes. One is struck when the mask is uncovered on it about its depravity, brutality, and so forth. Like Nada said previously, the even Syria and perhaps Iran, perhaps other authoritarian countries. You go in the country, you live in the country, you don't know what's happening in your own street. You go to Beirut, for example, an open city, you know not what's just happening in Beirut, what's happening in the world. So this the fear, the wall of silence has fallen all overnight in Syria, and one comes to grips immediately with the nature of this regime, no matter how much one is familiar with it, and books have written on it, and scholarly books and so forth, plus eyewitness narratives. But that's what strikes you. For example, crossing from the Jordanian border to Damascus, one passes the city of Sanamin. Just before it, there is a roadblock called Maknat al-Hatab, and I mean, it's something out of Pulp Fiction. There is no military value to this roadblock, but it is manned by dozens. It was manned, and you can see the remains of the tanks, dozens of battleship tanks, battlefield tanks, by the 4th Division of Maher al-Assad, and built on two huge ramps to overlook the passers-by on the main highway from Jordan to Damascus. Its function was not military. Its function was to sow fears in front of the people and extort them. And that roadblock alone, Maher al-Assad received millions of dollars a week just from that one roadblock, which was regarded as one of the worst in Syria. So the just coming into terms with these regimes once they fall is astonishing. For example, we heard a lot about Hama, the massacre in 1982, but not a single video, not a single picture emerged from Hama. One Japanese diplomat who became an ambassador in the Gulf, remember him saying that when he entered Hama, it smelled like burnt flesh. The city smelled like burnt flesh a week after the massacre. And now, just with the fall of this regime, people who are not just so exclusively got that exclusive opportunity to go to Syria. Now everyone knows, everyone can go to Syria and experience what this regime was like.
So similar to Nada's point about the smell and how it stays with you when you finally go back in. Lizzie, you are based in Turkey, which is a country with massive strategic interest in Syria. It also backed for years those who are currently in power now. But it is also one of the main host countries of Syrian refugees. What was the atmosphere like there when this all happened last year?
Yeah, it was extremely emotional for lots of people here. I mean, I remember I sort of when on the Sunday morning that Assad fell, I was messaging people and people couldn't believe it. They were, shocked, crying, admitting that they'd cried for the first time in years. There was a lot of joy here. I mean, there was kind of celebrations here. In the streets, there were 3 million Syrian refugees at that time in the country, roughly, although we don't know exactly how many because some people aren't registered. Um, there was an immediate, I would say, an initial burst of people who went to the borders to go back. So the land borders, there were one or two at that time that were they set up very quickly to enable people to return. So there were Turkish authorities at the border, and they were essentially like sort of cancelling people's right to remain in Turkey, and people were going back. And so I went down there straight away. And people just said, yeah, we don't care if, we have nothing left in Syria, we're going back. I mean, that is obviously some people, and I think we'll talk a bit more about the actual challenges of going back and what things are preventing a far greater number of people from not going back. But there was definitely an initial surge of people who said, this has never been my country, we're grateful they've kept us here, or others were a bit more critical, but we want to go home. We're going home. So they did. I mean, there was queues at that time. And then I went into Syria across the land border. So I had a bit of a different experience because I went through this northern Syria, which some of it was already held by various rebel groups, and then I went into Aleppo, which had been under the regime. And yeah, I mean, I'd been writing about these places for so many years, and then suddenly I was there, and I couldn't really believe it that I was actually able to go to these places that had been effectively banned from us and from many Syrians for years. So, I mean, and then from the Turkish perspective, very quickly you saw engagement with the new authorities in Damascus. I mean, it was just days afterwards that Turkey announced, right, we've got a new chargé d'affaires in Damascus, we're reopening the embassy. You had the head of Turkish intelligence, Ibrahim Kalin, going to Damascus to pray with Ahmed al in the Umayyad Mosque. This was very much the displays of a newfound power. And they said, right, this was sort of them cementing from the very beginning, we are going to be one of the big players in Syria. They sort of, they said, they didn't say outwardly, we backed these rebels to go into Damascus,
But
but they
yeah,
very much celebrated the fact that it happened.
yeah.
So, and still are doing so. They sort of tried very much at that point. It was, they said we tried to reach out to Bashar at the time that lots of countries
Mm,
were reestablishing links with Assad, thinking that he was going to be in power forever. They said, well, we tried and he didn't respond to our calls. So it was very much a kind of right, we tried that, he didn't work, and now we're very much going all in with these, the new authorities in
mm.
Damascus. So that's a little bit of how things were from the Turkish perspective.
Before I go ahead to Ali, I just want to remind everyone online that if they have any questions for our panelists, to please send them across in the chat and we will get to them as well. Ali, I want us to rewind a bit. So we talked about the fall of the regime, but to rewind a bit to the few days that led to this, and we were covering it here in the newsroom. We had a lot of discussions. But still, December 8th kind of took us by surprise. Did you think that it would result in the fall of the Assad regime when it started, or at what moment did you realize that this is what would happen?
Absolutely not. I woke up and the regime has already fallen, and it was a shock and a surprise. And my testimony is not as really detailed as Nada, Lizzie, and Khaled, who have done amazing work in Syria over the last year. But I must tell you that when I heard the news, I was at the Doha Forum in Qatar. And there were many press conferences planned, for example, with the Iranian foreign minister. He had a session that was canceled with the UN envoy. And there was so much confusion among all those officials and among all those regional players. For example, at the UN envoy's press conference, which he went ahead with, he didn't answer any question because he didn't know what to do. Like he answered with, I don't know. Let's wait and see. Who knows? So it was a shock for everyone. Now we'll talk about this in a bit and how it is a kind of a domino effect. But the
Yeah.
moment it happened and the speed that carried the rebels into Damascus was really shocking. And I want to add that at this same conference, by the way, and this was a very quick reaction from all the major players. Even the Iranian foreign minister who was there, and before he left, he had meetings with the Qataris and with the Turks. For example, the Turkish foreign minister was there, and the Qatari, of course, prime minister, and other international and regional players. And they all sat down in the hours. And the moment that the rebels entered Damascus, they started having very quick meetings. to set or just to try to put a roadmap for the day after in political Syria and for this new chapter in Syria. And I think they succeeded somehow in offering a kind of a path, and we're seeing the outcome. We will discuss the results, of course, in a bit, but this is how it went. It was a very interesting and unforgettable moment at this forum.
And yeah, like you said, we'll get to it later because you saw him at this Doha forum. He was on stage. So yeah, a lot of changes in 1 year. Khalid, I want to ask you the same thing because you were on top of the coverage during those days of the offensive. Did you realize that it would result into some drastic change like it did, the fall of the regime?
I mean, it was preceded by the fall of the main cities in Syria, Aleppo and crucially Homs, which meant that Assad's seat of power in Damascus has become effectively surrounded. So the question was not the technicalities of whether the regime will fall or not, but whether Russia would come to his aid, and that was the
Yeah.
but then, and it later emerged that maybe even in Doha, an arrangement was quickly made between Russia, Turkey mainly, for a sort of let's say a collapse without the Iraq scenario, without looting, without attacks on Russian bases. Was quickly reached. So once Russia lifted its protection on the regime, which never ever the regime's core supporters, especially the Alawites in the heartland, thought Russia would do. It was a matter of hours, like it happened. Not that anyone knew, but this was what was going on in the background.
Yeah. I just want to look a bit at the coverage that we've done over the past year. So Nada, as you mentioned earlier, one of your first trips when you went back was to the notorious Sednaya prison, where undescribable horrors took place there during the Assad regime. And you also visited a secret hospital wing for foreign fighters. So tell us about how, seeing the prison, especially firsthand, but also the mass graves that you went to and all these things that were uncovered and what it told us about what we thought we knew about the horrors of the Assad regime, but actually how bad it was.
First of all, when you're covering Syria from outside of Syria, you're always hearing stories and doing interviews and doing coverage about people that have had people go missing in their lives, either through the prison system, at checkpoints, for political reasons, for non-political reasons. And when you're doing it from far away, you get an idea of the scale of it, but it's also not the same as when you see it firsthand. When I got there, I realized really the full scale. I spoke with my relatives, with friends, childhood friends, people that I randomly saw on the street, interview subjects, waiters, chauffeurs. I mean, literally everyone that I spoke to had a story of a loved one or a family member or a friend that had gone missing and disappeared into that infamous prison system. So when I got to Sednaya, it was thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. They were walking kilometers just to get to the prison because it was impossible to drive up there. And that included fighters as well that had just, swept in through the offensive. And the first thing they did was go up to the prisons and to the security branches in search of loved ones. So it was a mixture of fighters and civilians, and everyone was just desperately looking for any kind of clue, whether they were in the prisons or there was documentation that proved that they may have been in the prisons at some point, or they were one of the security branches. They were just looking for clues, which at the time was so difficult to find. After Sednaya, I also visited, not on the same day, but I went to 2 different security branches, and the regime had escaped, very chaotically. They had burned one of the branches. They had scattered as many documents as they could, taken the computers. So what was left was just a chaos of scattered documentation that everyone was looking through, families of missing ones that were trying to scan where their loved ones may have been and so far and so forth. But I was looking through them and I would see, for example, the reason that some people were arrested. Some of it was as simple as someone had just gone into the prison system for years for riding, for example, a motorcycle. Um, uh, I mean, really simple things could get you disappeared. Once you're into the interrogation, they would get you to admit to, you know, all sorts of different things. It became really also clear because of how chaotic all of this documents were strewn everywhere, being stepped on, half burnt. I mean, and these security branches are huge. The need for documentation, the need for organizing them, for different organizations to come in and start doing some sort of organizational system so that they can keep track and try to help the families of the loved of the missing, to try to find a resolution to what happened to their people. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, Sednaya was horrible enough. The security branches, I think, were even worse for me because I saw them. It wasn't as chaotic when I went. There wasn't tens of thousands of people there. They were basically empty except for some scattered people that were looking for clues. And I went into the cells basically as they had been left. As the rebels swept in, they've, you know, flung open all of the prison doors. So everything was left as is. And I'm going to go back to this idea of the smell that I smelled, but the stench in these cells, you'd see sleeping bags packed together. You could tell that people were sitting in corners and not moving. Food that was rotting was still hung up on the walls. The amount of art on the walls, I mean, I would have to show you slides. You could tell people had been there for years and years and years. And actually, we met with someone that had returned to the security branch after he was released on December 8th, just looking for his documentation. He needed to find his ID card so that he can get on with his life. And he explained to us what life was like for the past year of his. He had been detained for 8 months. And yeah, and he was towards the end. He said he was losing hope for life until the prisons were open and the security branches were open. But it was a very bleak description of what his life was like when he was there. Yeah.
And Lizzie, you went to some of the areas that also suffered most of the bombardment throughout the war. So like Aleppo, Hama, Homs. You also went to Qusayr and Palmyra. So tell us a bit about what it was like there.
Yeah, so driving into Aleppo, there's just miles and miles of destroyed suburb and villages. And they're empty. I mean, I think like Nada said, you know, you hear about these, you know, you constantly we were covering, you know, before bombings and, you know, people being terrified and the level of the destruction. But yeah, it's really different when you see it and you feel it and you feel the silence in those areas. It's similar in Homs and areas actually quite near the city centre, just dead. I mean, there's nothing there. So that sort of gives you an indication of the scale of the rebuilding and also why people are not coming back because they don't have anything to go back to. Al Qusayr was similarly pancaked in many places, and Palmyra was a ghost town. We stayed overnight there and there was no electricity, no phones, no restaurants, no hotels. We had to stay with a relative of someone we were speaking to. Actually, there was like one place that they were able to get food from. There was no telephone signal. There was nothing. I think in Al Qusayr as well, the parts that were not so bombed that rebels had gone into were shocking for me in that, again, they were places, so there were Hezbollah training centers essentially. And, you know, that was always a place that I'd heard about through years in Lebanon. Al Qusayr, that's, you know, across the border where and Hezbollah's taken it over. And you go in and there's a room and it's full of Hezbollah's stuff, essentially. And, you know, so seeing that in person was a place that you'd heard about being so notorious. And same with Palmyra as well, which was a lot of Iran-backed militias were there as well. That was also very shocking. And took me aback quite a bit. But yeah, the level of destruction there, I think that's something that I've thought about a lot in terms of rural areas that we don't, you know, often if sort of Western thinkers are thinking about the center of Aleppo and the center of Damascus, and okay, we can go out in Damascus, it's okay, and you can drive around and stuff. If you don't see the rural areas that have been depopulated and been emptied and destroyed, those are a hugely important part of Syria that is going to get forgotten. So I think rural areas, we really need to keep them in mind when we talk about Syria.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if they aren't rebuilt, then we get into this worrying situation like we have in other countries where you get mass migration to urban centers and over stress on the infrastructure of those already,
Yeah.
in bad shape city centers. So support to rural areas, I think, or focus, let's say, as well on rural areas as well as on
Yeah.
urban centers. I think that's something that's really important.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm glad actually that you mentioned Hezbollah as well, because obviously Syria was a place where not just a lot of countries were involved, but there were so many stakeholders involved, one of them being Hezbollah. And if we zoom out and go back to December 2024, we were more than a year into the war in Gaza, and it was just a month after a ceasefire was, well, a shaky ceasefire came into effect between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was supposed to end the war there after largely decimating the group. So, Ali, I want to ask you, did the fall of the Assad regime happen in a vacuum, or did all these developments in the region need to happen that were a result of the war in Gaza?
We've heard the term, the dominoes effect a lot during the past year. And I think it's an accurate term to describe what happened in Syria. I mean, we were all surprised by how fast the regime collapsed, and especially Damascus. We were expecting some kind of a longer fight that would, go on for like months or even years, but it didn't happen. But the shock itself, it's part of a dominoes effect that started with the Gaza war. And at the time of the regime's collapse, we've seen, and as you mentioned, Aveen, a fragile ceasefire in Lebanon, which Hezbollah agreed to. It's a very, very weak ceasefire that put Hezbollah and Lebanon in a very difficult position. And it came after Nasrallah was killed, and after the pagers attacks on Hezbollah. So the group was definitely in its weakest position. And when we talk about Hezbollah, we have to mention Iran also, of course. I mean, if Hezbollah is weakened, then Iran is weakened too. And its hand in Syria was already shaking. And also in terms of international diplomacy and interest, I mean, Russia was already starting to recalibrate its position and its diplomatic ventures and military adventures and vision for the Middle East and the region. So it was the right time, and it was a domino effect that started with the Gaza war, then with the Hezbollah defeat, then the weakening of Iran's hand and proxies in the region, and then with Russia recalibrating its position. I want to just add that all this happened very quickly, and it's been a year, but until now, we are still trying to absorb all the details and all the behind the scenes discussions and plans that have happened then. So it's really, really a massive geopolitical earthquake that happened, and we are still feeling it until now, and we're going to still feel it for years to come.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing that was happening at the time, and maybe it makes us wonder, Lizzie, if whether this was, you know, something that could lead up to the fall of the Assad regime. Maybe Turkey was trying to cement its foothold more. But it also came on the back of the peace process that Turkey launched within its own country with the PKK. And we know that Turkey has accused the Kurdish administration in Syria of being the Syrian offshoot of the PKK. Do you think we would have seen more violence in the past year between the Kurds and government forces, or between Kurds in Syria and Turkey, had this peace process with the PKK not being launched? And do you think it would have been a different dynamic now if that hadn't happened?
I think definitely that the fall of Assad made it easier to bring forward, to speed up this peace process. It had already been sort of floated
So
before.
another domino effect, as
Yeah,
as Ali was
exactly,
mentioning. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, it had already been floated before by some allies of Erdogan in Turkey. But then when Assad fell, it was kind of for Turkey, it was okay. So now this massive group in Syria that we think is essentially the offshoot of the PKK, and some of them very
Mm,
much do have, they were PKK, they are PKK, right? So they are now stuck between us and a regime in Damascus that we are going to, fully back. And they are going to be squeezed into a corner essentially. And so they will have less other choice other than to disarm. Now, of course, they still haven't worked out how this is going to happen exactly. The
mm,
SDF I'm talking about here, there's an agreement was signed in March between the government in Damascus and the SDF, but that actually hasn't been implemented yet because they're tussling over the contours of how that actually happens. But I think that definitely Turkey saw it as a good opportunity to move this peace process forward. And I think, I don't want to put words in his head. We don't know what he's thinking in his
mm,
prison, but Öcalan is okay. Well, now those Kurds in Syria are, they don't have much other choice now,
yeah.
because previously they were able to build up this sort of zone of autonomy away from Assad, who wasn't really strong enough or willing enough to do anything with them apart from trade with them a bit. They had a nice export line of oil into the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
Mm,
And they were there and they were able to kind of enjoy their power there. But now there is much more pressure on them from Damascus and from all of the land that Shadah is now in control of, with the backing of Turkey, for them to disarm, which is where we are at now in this sticky process. And I would say that, that is still, this is still a big point of tension in Syria. The fact that you've still got a huge swathe of the country containing most of the resources, the gas, the oil, the water,
mm,
vast swathes of agricultural land under the control of entity that is not answering to the central government.
yeah.
That is still a huge point of tension. And I think some sources that I've spoken to have said, well, we've seen massacres against other minorities in Syria. Why would they give up their guns?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we're scared that that's going to happen to the Kurds as well. So there is the security reality of the rest of the country has weighed upon the ability to unite in terms of the Kurdish held areas as well.
Hmm. Yeah, we will get into the whole minority issue because, of course, over the past year, we've seen waves of violent episodes targeting the various minority groups in Syria. But before that, given that we've spoken about Turkey, Iran, Hezbollah, we can't ignore Russia. That was a big player throughout the war and the main backer of Bashar al-Assad, currently hosting him in Russia. Khalid, in the last year, how has Russia recalibrated its relationship with Syria and with the new Syrian government? And how is it trying to gain foothold once again in the country? Because, of course, it had, key interests in Syria. And Nada, if you want to interject on that one as well, feel free to do so.
Well, you have a meeting of two supreme pragmatists in Putin and in Ahmad al-Shara. So the main objective of the new regime in Syria was to keep Russia at bay, because Russia could do lots of damage to the new regime, sponsoring, for example, an insurgency in the coast, or just by its sheer power in the country. So the policy of Ahmed Shara was just it's like guarding Michael Jordan in the NBA. Michael Jordan is going to score on you, so you just want him to score the least amount of points possible. And this has been Sharaf's approach to Russia. And he's been very careful, for example, not to call publicly for the handover of Bashar al-Assad, not to sort of embarrass Putin in any way. And at the same time, the Russia initiated a rapprochement with Sharaf. He responded. He visited Moscow. And his hope is that Russia could be bulk work, as well as Turkey, against the Israeli incursions into Syria. But let's not kid ourselves. The United States Syria is the United States baby now. With whatever the rhetoric of Turkey, of Russia, you have 2,000 American soldiers in the country, small force that can decide where and keep all other powers at bay, including Russia.
Well, good point. And yeah, I wanted to say the US has entered center stage as well in Syria now, whereas before it was very limited to supporting the SDF mainly. Nada, anything you want to add on this?
Yeah. So clearly, I mean, the agreement after President Shadar went to Moscow, Russia was permitted to retain its bases. But there is a difference on the ground with how it used to operate versus how it operates now, whereas previously it commonly did patrols in Hmeimim and Tartus. Even tourism, for example, was catered towards Russians. Previously, you have, for example, souvenirs that had Cyrillic that were written in Cyrillic and so on. That has changed. First of all, in Hmeimim, which suffered significantly from the massacres in the coast as well, but it's pretty empty, not just from the residents who are predominantly Alawite, but also there are no Russian patrols happening anymore. We spoke to residents and they say that at most, they'll cross from point A to point B, but they're not stopping anywhere.
Yeah.
So the economy in that area has suffered significantly. And Tartus, the same thing. There is no more Russian tourism and barely a presence anymore. So while they're able to retain these bases, their presence is not nearly as felt as it was before. Before you would see Russian soldiers walking around Damascus in the malls and so on. You don't see that anymore.
Ali, you've seen Shara on a few global stages over the past year. So, his past and his affiliation to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Al-Qaeda before keep coming back to torment him. How has he managed to rehabilitate himself on the global stage?
Did he, though? I mean, he's still
I don't know.
trying fully
Trump loves him.
to fully achieve that goal, and he managed to build relationships across the region and outside the region. And as Khalid said, he is pragmatic and he's a smart politician. But this past hunting him, I mean, on Saturday, he was on stage at the Doha Forum again, 1 year after the fall of the regime. And he was described on stage as a former terrorist. And he commented on this specific part of the question for like 5 minutes. And he tried to explain not only that being called a terrorist, it's a political term. He said that he was proud of his past and that he had fought 20 years with honor and never harmed a civilian. Now, what does that say? It does say that he is not trying to overcome his past or hide his past. On the contrary, he wanted to project that his past is what led him to be in Damascus, in the presidential palace, and what would lead him to unite Syria and become a strong and powerful president and build strong and powerful and pragmatic relations across the region. Now, every country deals with al-Sharia depending on their interest. And I think he's playing on all fronts and he's trying to balance all the interests into one basket. And this could pay off, or like everyone who tried similar strategy in the Middle East, it could backfire.
Mm. And like you said, he's called several times on Syrians to unite and come together. But of course, in order for that to happen, a lot of the mistrust that still exists among different communities and among Syrians with regards to the new regime has to go. And this is something you've touched upon a few times, all of you, in the discussion today. The violence that, did happen over the past year, particularly targeting minority groups such as the Alawites, the Druze, and to a lesser extent, the Kurds. To what extent have these attacks that we saw in the Alawite coastal areas and in the south, targeting Druze, are they necessarily a result of sectarian tension, or, is it a product of revenge attacks that they wanted to carry out, particularly against the Alawites, given that Bashar al-Assad was also a member of the religious sect? Is it also a product of a lot of misinformation going on? What was the sense that you got, Nada?
I think it depends on who you speak to. But I think that Ahmed al-Shara has made a concerted effort to attempt to bring together the security forces to centralize them. I think over the last 13, 14 years of war, there has been a lot of sectarian resentment that came about because of Bashar al-Assad's use of minorities and his weaponization and leveraging of them to protect himself. I think sectarianism is a part of it. Certainly revenge attacks are a part of it. There are people that I have spoken to that are very open about the fact that they want, for example, to seek revenge on, let's say, the Alawites. We've seen bombings of churches, of Christians in churches, and, most recently Suwaida, and also in Aleppo with the Kurds. So these things are happening sporadically, and sometimes they are incredibly violent, and they have led to a massive mistrust of minorities throughout Syria, where a lot of these areas are calling for autonomy. Most significantly, you could see that in Suwaida as well as in northeastern Syria. We're going to see how that's going to play out, and if minorities, if that trust can be gained back in any meaningful way. But it's not only minorities. Even also if you go to Damascus, which is a cosmopolitan city, it's the capital, multi-sectarian. Also, that mistrust has bled into other aspects of society, even amongst, for example, Sunni Muslims, which is Ahmed al-Shara's primary constituency.
And then with the Druze in southern Syria, Khalid, you wrote a lot about this as well, and we saw Israel intervening with its own pretext of protecting the Druze, and now creating their own sort of incursion in the south and maintaining their position there. How would you say regional actors responded to this violence, and has Israel been using it for its own interests?
Just some context, please. In the overall discussion about the Druze, the minorities of Syria are not cohesive, and each has its own history. So the Druze religious leadership had resisted Assad, refused to allow the Druze to join the army after Assad actually sent an almost all Druze unit to Homs, and 130 perished at the start of the conflict. So the Druze had neutralized themselves, and actually in the last 2 years of the regime, the Druze, the former regime, the Druze leadership rose up, supported civil disobedience, peaceful uprising against Bashar al-Assad that was both protected by Israel and by Russia. The Alawites are a different story. The Alawites underpinned the regime until the end, of course, not all of them, and refused to listen to the civil figures in the Alawite community who said, look, we cannot, Assad is leading our community to ruin. We cannot, you at least be neutral, not support him. And it reminds me of the story in when Christ was taken to the Roman emperor and he was the Roman emperor was asked to execute him, and the Roman said, "But this man didn't do anything." And then the Jewish elders said, "No, no, execute him and let his blood be upon us and upon our children." So the view by the majority that the Alawites bear a huge responsibility of the atrocity of the regime, rightly or wrongly, is not the same vis-a-vis the Druze. So again, the Druze have historically been fearful of survival, and the advent of a government with militant players in Damascus raised the fears of the community. Regardless of the role of Israel, this is what underpinned the community's fear of the new regime in Sweden. How events played out, even the foreign minister, the Syrian foreign minister, admitted that, or he said that, look, we all fell into a trap. This shouldn't have happened, and so forth. And apparently, it was the interior minister, the more hard-lined interior minister, who convinced Shara to go into Sweden. So basically, Shara's constituency is not really very supportive, or not as supportive of the campaign on Sweden as it was against the Alawite heartland. And now Shara is basically waiting for Sweden to implode. That's what he's waiting for, the internal contradictions within the Druze leadership and so forth to bring it to its knees, to bring the province to its knees.
Yeah.
And as Nata mentioned, in southern Syria, especially among the Druze, but also, this has been a call among the Kurds for years and years for decentralization and federalism. My question to all of you is, do you think decentralization or federalism in Syria would work? Yes, no?
Who do you want to go first?
I mean, no is the short answer. I do think local councils and local municipalities need to be given authority to spend money and do things that they know that their people need, right? Like we've seen in other countries in the region, even in other countries in the West, etc. If everything's happening in London or Washington and local municipalities can't spend money in the way that those local people want, they're going to get miffed, right? So I do think that there needs to be some level of autonomy, particularly when there is this little bit of a tendency to, what we're doing is right. We're not wrong. We're never wrong, which I do sometimes hear from some officials in Syria. They need to be held to account by local councils with an element of, saying things to say, look, we know our people want to spend money on X, Y, and Z, and we need budget for X, Y, and Z or whatever. But I do not believe in kind of breaking up the country into certain areas. I mean, having reported a lot in Iraq, I know that lots has been gained from the Kurds in Iraq having a level of autonomy, and in terms of their identity, it is, it's very heartening to see that in the Kurdish identity in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. But you have long-running instabilities in Iraq because of the federal system. You've got whole areas where no one knows who's in control. And so you get ISIS there, you get Iran-backed militias there, you get thugs in those areas doing whatever they want. You still have huge budget issues between Baghdad and the Kurdistan region because they can't decide who is supposed to be responsible for what spending and what budgeting. And these have been going on for 2 decades
And
now.
here you would have it with even more areas, not just
Right,
one.
right, exactly. So, and those debates at least in the Iraqi context that I've seen, have prevented them moving forward in many ways, and have meant that, in the Kurdistan region, because they have a fight with Baghdad over the budget, people go without money for months on end. So, and people can't afford to do anything, and then they want to leave Kurdistan region and go to Europe. I've reported on that in detail. So, because they don't have any money, right? Because of this federal system that means that they are always fighting over the budget. So it's risky.
Nada, very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, I agree with Lizzie that local councils and municipalities should have a certain level of autonomy, but at the same time, I don't know that federalism in Syria would work the same way that federalism in other places work. For example, you look at the United States, it's a bunch of different states, it has sort of federalism. The United States is not made up of each state being different, a different multi-religious ethnicity, or even it's not like, Texas is just where the merchant class lives, and then Arkansas is where the Kurds live, and so on. I mean, so when you have a split up Syria, that is what it's going to end up being. So I think it's going to make these identities even more concrete, and the otherness even more concrete, and potentially lose the sense of Syrian unity. So if there's going to be some sort of federalism or some sort of semi-autonomy in any of these areas, there needs to be a way that's figured out within, an overall centralized structure. And I also think that Syrian authorities need to be as well open to the fact that, and they've shown this openness, but I think that because the talks with the Kurds right now are stalled for a variety of different reasons, among those is, for example, the Kurds want the YPG, the female fighters, to be integrated into the army, and the Syrian authorities don't want that. Or have shown resistance to it. So I think that there needs to be some give and take on both sides, but I also think that there is a sense of Syrianness on all sides. That's something that that people have held on to throughout all of this, despite all of these different attacks. For example, in Sweden, now we're seeing more and more of a gravitational pull towards Israel, unfortunately. But everyone that I speak to says it's very unfortunate. We're Syrian. We've always considered ourselves Syrian. We've never considered that we wanted to be completely separate, despite this kind of semi-autonomy that they had throughout the regime. So I think all parties involved think it's very regrettable that the loss of Syrian identity is happening slowly.
Aveen, if I can just add one point very quickly. Still have a few minutes left.
Yes.
With Lizzie and Nada, of course. I mean, the authorities in Damascus must try to strike a balance between autonomy and federalism, and giving local councils more power, but at the same time preserving the unity of Syria. And there is one more factor, which is I don't think that regional actors or regional players or regional countries would easily accept a fragmented and divided Syria, because then everything that they have built, they would have to build from scratch with each entity separately. And this worries them if every entity would be loyal or would be allied with them or not. It's a big project, and I don't think it will have a regional acceptance.
Yeah, I think the same. And I think most countries in the region have been vocal about that, especially in the context of Iraq as well. There's so much more to unpack, but we're running out of time. Ali, I wanted to ask you, based on your experience in covering such major turning points as was the fall of the Assad regime, you've been on the ground in places like Iraq and Libya. From your experience, or from how you see it, what was the worst case scenario that Syria managed to avoid when we look back at the past year, despite, certain violent episodes here and there? And what are the main challenges ahead when it comes to rebuilding as a country?
I think this is exactly what we just discussed. I mean, until now, it's been a year, and they avoided or prevented the country being fragmented and divided. And one more thing, which is they prevented the country from sliding into a civil war. Despite the atrocities and despite the attacks, the country is still not in civil war mode. And I would say that one of the main challenges that I've seen elsewhere, especially in Libya, is how to convince people who took up arms, like civilians, and fought against the regime to hand over their guns and weapons and authority now and go back to civil life. Libya has been struggling with this for 14 years, since 2011, and they haven't been able to find a solution. And I think this is one of the major obstacles that would maybe prevent a united army or stability for a long time. There is also, within this context, there is the question of foreign fighters, and I'm sure my colleagues have more insights. Nada has worked on this subject for a very long time. What do you do with them? Do you give them
Yeah.
the nationality? Do you integrate them into the armed forces? Do you give them special units? Do you pay them and tell them thank you so much for your service? So there is this main question, and it's a major obstacle, and it's a major issue that can harm stability and security over the long period.
Khalid, very quickly, we have a few minutes left. Where are we now with transitional justice and accountability? Because I think that's one of one of the main hurdles ahead, and also with integration into armed forces of all these different factions that are still armed.
I mean, every day, maybe dozens, or let's say every week, dozens of Syrians are killed. They are mostly Sunnis, and they are mostly because the previous regime had advertised what it does. Every Syrian knows who's the security informant living in his neighborhood and so forth. So you've had a non-stop, incessant wave of revenge killings that was mostly against the Sunnis who worked with the regime. After all, they were the majority, plus what we saw on the Alawite coast and so forth. So people have taken justice, so-called justice, into their own hands. No person in Idlib who his two cousins came back from Aleppo. They were regime agents. He killed them both in one afternoon. He spent a couple of weeks in prison and he got out. Let's put it this way: there is a long way for transitional justice to occur. Sorry, what was your second question on?
Just about the different armed factions, whether it's SDF or other foreign fighters, and how, the process of integrating them into one.
I think the head of the Republican Guards that Sharia has resurrected is a Jordanian militant. So he cannot, as Ali mentioned, he cannot just say, thank you very much and goodbye. These people want, like the rest of others, they want a war dividend. So it's going to take time to deal with this foreign jihadist issue. And this is one of the still stumbling blocks between the relationship between Sharia and the United States. They accepted his argument for now that, look, if I let them go, there'll be Rome everywhere and they'll be a threat. Let me try to amalgamate them into the new security forces.
Yeah, and also still a lot of ISIS presence and ISIS affiliates just being held in camps with no resolution. Quickly, we're getting to the end. Nada and Lizzie, what have you seen in terms of changes in humanitarian access on the ground? Because, of course, that's a huge issue, particularly in more rural areas. And have refugees been returning to Syria? And maybe you can speak more from your experience from Lebanon and Turkey.
Shall I go first?
Go for it. No, go ahead.
So obviously around the world, humanitarian funding has dropped off massively. UN cuts, USAID cuts, etc. So aid is always insufficient. People, maybe things can get through other channels other than, the channels that the Assad regime allowed into certain places. But people are struggling not only because of lack of aid, but because of, a lack of work opportunities. That's one thing that's really keeping people away. I think in terms of refugee returns, so from Turkey, it's 550,000 people have gone back since Assad fell, which is only a proportion of, there's still 2.5 million Syrians in Turkey, right? So for some context, I think, look, people have set up lives here. Their kids are in school. They've maybe learned Turkish. You don't need me to tell you that Syrians are extremely bright and hardworking, and they will work and make things work where they are. And so they have done that. It's a whole class here now of Syrians who have okay lives. I don't want to say that their lives are great in Turkey because it's hard, but you know, when you pit that having, an apartment with electricity and relative stability, and if
Yeah.
you've got your residency permits versus going back to, maybe a place where there are, killings on a daily basis still, and the infrastructure is terrible. There's no school for your kids. There's no healthcare. That's the
Yeah.
kind of choice. And then from Europe, more, if people have been given, maybe passports, maybe long-term residencies,
Yeah.
are in jobs where they have ability to earn better salaries.
And
Yeah. So that's
thank
why people are, maybe not going back.
yeah. And just quickly, Nada, because I think we're pushing it a bit now, the time.
Yes. Listen, I think that after December 8, people were really gearing to go. Everyone wanted to go home, whether they were refugees or exiles, whether they were in nearby countries or had received asylum abroad. So many people were excited for it, and so many people did go. In Lebanon alone, almost 400,000 people have gone back to Syria. I think worldwide it's 1 point something, and then also 1.9 million IDPs have returned. But we've also seen a drop off of people going to Syria since those early months, and it is because of the bad economy, the lack of basic services. Lizzie talked a little bit about going to Al Qusayr and seeing these areas flattened. That was where I did my last coverage of Syrian refugees that were living in Lebanon, returning to their villages, and their villages are completely gone. When I say completely gone, I mean not a single building left standing in an entire village, multiple villages. So they go back and they're either living in tents all over again that are given to them by the UN, or they're renting houses and they're unable to raise the cost of rebuilding, or they're rebuilding and they're going into severe debt and living in an area that has no services whatsoever, basically establishing life from all over again. Life in Lebanon for refugees is hard. Lebanese authorities have made it very difficult for Syrians to live in Lebanon, especially because they really were fearful of the war extending for a very long time and having a permanent presence, because a quarter of refugees and the quarter of Lebanon's population was refugees. So it's not easy in Lebanon, but I think people have learned how to navigate Lebanon despite its challenges. Right now, some people are going, but a lot of people have decided that they're going to wait and see what's going to happen in terms of security, in terms of economy, in terms of what kind of aid is available. The government is not able to do much. Right now, it's different municipalities that are relying completely on fundraising endeavors, essentially from the diaspora, from business people, and a little bit from municipal funding. Yeah.
And just very quickly, Khaled, to get your perspective as well from Jordan, because that was a country that was also hugely impacted by Syrian refugees.
Jordan is a bit different, for example, than Turkey because of the Syrians have traditionally played the main role in the establishment of the kingdom, and especially in North Jordan, which is an extension of the Horan Plain. So on society-wise, the Syrians have been welcomed in Jordan, partly because of this family and clan ties, and because they have been, for example, rents have went up in Jordan, property markets improved in North Jordan because of the Syrian refugees, and so they have work, especially in the farms in North Jordan. So the people vote with their feet, right?
Yeah.
They have been partial return, not as much as Turkey or maybe Lebanon, just because the conditions for Syrian refugees in Jordan is better. Lots of US aid, European aid was directed towards the refugee, less now. But it's Jordan for them probably better than going back to a home that doesn't exist.
Yeah, definitely. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of this discussion. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. And if any of you have any more questions or feedback, or you'd like to get in touch with any of the panelists for more questions, then please send them at the email address that has been sent to the chat. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.